Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Yes, it is true. First of all, I want to say thank you to ISI and to YAL here at Purdue and all the donors who made this possible and all the hardworking students who helped put it together and the staff people and everybody. I'm very grateful for this, and it's wonderful. It's just great that you guys all put this effort together. I want to make some note because Harry Verizor very kindly made reference to my book Meltdown, which, as Murphy, as how he likes to be called, mentioned, was a New York Times bestseller and did very well in 2009. I didn't actually have copies of it here today. That's why it's very flattering to say, oh, they must have all sold out. That's why they're not there. It's very sweet to think of it that way. But to my horror, when I went out to my garage my inventory center, to pack my books, I realized I had one copy of Meltdown left. Somehow I had just allowed this not to be reordered, and it was just a disaster. And then somebody arranged with me in advance, said, I want 6 of your titles, and here's the ones that I want. And so that one Meltdown was already reserved for this person who I don't think showed up. So I do have one Meltdown. So now, in an orderly fashion, after this is over, we can try. Exactly, that's right. We'll make it into a fundraiser for ISI. Well, also, you can always, if you're disappointed, you can go to meltdownthebook.com and get a free chapter. So that's a great thing that my publisher did. Incidentally, my publisher is a bunch of very, very good sports, because when I proposed to them, look, there needs to be a free market book on the financial crisis, and it's got to come out immediately, because we all know what the standard story is going to be, right? We all know it's going to be the free market failed, and you people are all a bunch of schmucks for believing in it, and all that. Like, you knew that was going to happen. I said, we need to have an alternative, a different narrative of this out there immediately. And the response I got, and this is a publisher I've been with for a number of books and have had some success with them, and they said, well, I don't know, we're not really convinced about it. And then I thought, yeah, maybe it's a dumb idea. And then a week passed, and it's the first time I've ever second-guessed a publisher. I wrote to them and said, now, wait a minute, hold on. You're just wrong about this. We have to do this book. And so I persuaded them, and sure enough, there was actually a demand for something other than Paul Krugman's opinion of the situation. So that was the situation there. Because I think a lot of us feel the same way, that if we hear this same version of events one more time, we're just going to go out and commit an atrocity, right? So we've got to get our alternative point of view out there. And incidentally, with regard to books, people have asked me all morning, I've had people coming up asking me, when's your next book coming out? Well, in the past 5 years, I've written 5 books, just in the past 5 years. That's really, really tiring. So maybe there'll be a book someday, like in the year 2029 or something, but I have no plans for one right now. But ISI was generous enough to allow me, buried on your tables with all the literature there, you will find my flyer. This is what I'm doing now, libertyclassroom.com. Because I decided that instead of just griping about the fact that the professors don't teach what I think they should teach, and griping about the fact that the kids' heads are being filled with propaganda, why don't I just do something about it? Why don't I get on the internet and just teach stuff to people? Duh, right? This has been staring me in the face all this time. So I hope as a personal favor to me, you will visit libertyclassroom.com and check it out. It's the most important thing I've ever done by a mile. But the problem, of course, with the standard narrative is that the free market did not cause the financial crisis. And one of the main culprits was, in fact, the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is not a creation of the free market. The Federal Reserve, of course, is a creation of the U.S. Congress, the very antithesis of the free market. And yet, there's such confusion on this subject that even an eminence like Richard Posner, who was supposed to be more or less a free market thinker, in his treatment of the financial crisis, he said, yeah, the market caused the financial crisis. And when people pointed out to him that he himself pointed to the Federal Reserve as being a contributing factor, he said, well, the Federal Reserve is part of capitalism. Now, that's not helping when people who are supposed to be our friends are confusing things and muddying the waters to that degree, to the point where we can't even agree on what capitalism is. Now, I take capitalism and the free market to be synonymous. And these terms, for all the boogeyman definitions that we get in school, really mean something very simple. They simply refer to the array of voluntary exchanges that take place in society bounded by private property rights. That's it. That's all it is. And when you apply those criteria to the Federal Reserve, it does not pass the test. So this is not the free market's fault. Now, if I were going to talk about the housing boom and bust as a topic unto itself, indeed, I would say more than talk about just the Fed. I would talk about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the risks they took, the types of lending that they encouraged, knowing that if push came to shove, it seemed pretty likely the federal government would come to their assistance. And in my book, Rollback, I've got numerous quotations from Freddie Mac executives saying exactly this, that it worked out exactly as we all assumed it would, that if it ever came to that, the federal government would intervene. Various federal lending mandates, all different kinds, and the contributions that they made to the precarious nature of the housing market. The structure of prudential regulation. Professor Verizor made reference to this. This is supposed to keep this rickety house of cards stable by introducing prudential regulation, which means that if you're a bank and you're holding $100 in traditional loans, you've got to keep $10 of capital in reserve. But if you're holding a real estate loan, then you've got to hold only $5 in reserve for every $100. But if you are holding AAA-rated mortgage-backed securities, you have to hold only $2 in reserve. So whether or not you're a math major, I bet you can take a wild guess as to which asset class these institutions flock to, of course. So, in other words, these regulations encouraged a kind of herd mentality. So that instead of there being a diversification across an array of asset classes, which would have happened in the absence of such a structure, everybody's in this. And then when that category of assets turns out to have been vastly overvalued, everybody's in it. And the problem is all the worse. I would talk about restrictions on the free market in the form of restrictions on the ability of institutional investors, large-scale investors, pension funds, whatever, to discipline wayward bank management. This is a subset of the more general problem ever since the 1960s, that the federal government has made it harder for people to engage in corporate takeovers of any kind. And I think you can take a wild guess who lobbied for restrictions like that, crummy managers who don't want to be turned out. Well, the same thing applies in spades to financial institutions. It's very hard. You can't have more than a 1 or 2% share in a bank holding company if you're an institutional investor, so it's impossible for you to discipline their management. So these investors now are artificially scattered as compared to how they would be in a free market, and the management of these institutions is insulated to a degree that they would not be on a free market. I could talk about the failures of the ratings agencies, which were basically an SEC cartel. There are a lot of factors, in other words, but today we're going to focus on, and reluctantly, I have conceded that I will indeed talk about the Federal Reserve. I have been dragged kicking and screaming into this, but I will indeed discuss it. So what sort of role is played here? Let's start with a few simple ones. First one may be the most controversial because there will be those who will dispute my rendering of this. But certainly there were some investors who did believe that there was such a thing as the Greenspan put, which meant that if there were ever serious economic problems or asset prices of some particular kind fell below a certain level, that Greenspan and the Fed would intervene and put things right. And of course, the belief that this is likely to happen will influence the type of investments you're willing to make and the types of risks you're willing to take. If you believe that the losses, there's at least a fighting chance they may be socialized. But it's not just this informal policy of the Greenspan put, which of course Greenspan denies. It's the very institution of central banking itself institutionalizes the problem of moral hazard. We're all familiar with this term, that if I know that the losses are going to be socialized, I'm more likely to engage in risky behavior that might incur losses. If I rent a car, I know that since I don't have to care about the long-term flow of services from that car, and other people are going to have to bear the burdens associated with that car, I might just drive that rental car into the ground and just beat it up and treat it in ways I would never treat my own car because I know other people are going to suffer the consequences. That's moral hazard. When you behave in some way that the consequences of your behavior are not borne exclusively or even to any appreciable extent by you. They're borne by others. Well, the very fact that you have a central bank, a paper money producer, in the case of basically all the central banks of the world now, there is no gold standard, they're just paper money producers. Well, everybody knows that there is no physical constraint on the ability of these institutions to create money. The only thing that would prevent them from creating it is lack of will, lack of political will, which, as we've seen, this is rather a weak reed to rest your confidence on. And so that in itself tends to encourage wilder speculation than would otherwise exist, because you know that the instrument of bailouts stands ready. But also the Federal Reserve, and particularly in this most recent housing crisis, contributes to a lowering in loan quality. Now, we've blamed the lowering in loan quality on the adoption of no-doc mortgages or adjustable rate mortgages, no down payment mortgages, whatever. But we can't leave out the role of the Fed in all this. Because as Ludwig von Mises, the great Austrian economist, pointed out, it's not just in the reduction of the loan rate of interest that we see the consequences of an expansionary monetary policy. It's also in the reduction in the lending standards that banks use. That's where we also see the effects of monetary expansion. And the analogy that I use in Meltdown, that actually, this is an analogy my editor, Tim Carney, came up with, is a very good one. He says, suppose there's a basketball team, and we got a team, and you've got a pool of players, and this team gets to choose out of those players which ones will be on the team. So they choose all their players, and then they send all the, for lack of a better word, rejects home. But then all of a sudden the rules are changed, and they're allowed 2 more players. Where are they going to get those 2 more players? From the pool of rejects. So naturally, the very fact that they can now get more players means they're going to be getting players of lower caliber because they've already taken on the best players that they had. Well, the same thing goes in banking, that if the money supply is increased and open market purchases are made and a lot of money is flowing into the banks, up till very recently, have felt it to be in their interest to be lent out to the extent allowed by the law. So they want to lend this money out. They've already lent it out to the most credit-worthy borrowers. Now they've got to go out and search for other people who wouldn't have qualified before. And I want to share with you just a little brief passage from an article in probably not a journal that you subscribe to, and probably not a journal that you subscribed to back in 1926, the Journal of Land and Public Utility Economics. Now suddenly the live stream will go dead, mysteriously. But just this short passage, because this is a reference now, what's being described in this article is the credit boom of 1914 to 1920, roughly coinciding with World War I and shortly after the creation of the Fed. And I want you to notice that it sounds like they're describing the 2000s. Rising prices, says this author, affected both banks and their customers with an optimism which swept aside the conservative standards of experience and promoted extravagance and speculation. Whatever the customers purchased, whether merchandise or land, they were able to sell at an extraordinary profit. Whatever was produced on their farms brought unusual returns. Industry expanded and thrived, promoters of all types came into their own, and thrift gave way to extravagance. Bankers found their accustomed standards of credit analysis growing obsolete, for values increased automatically with the passage of time. Hence it was that as the speculative fever gained a foothold and grew, and the demands for bank funds enlarged, credit was extended to all manner of persons, on or without all kinds of security. Excess lines became commonplace. Customers' notes given to promoters of questionable and fraudulent enterprises were discounted for rich rewards, and large sums were advanced to land speculators. But that was not taken from a New York Times, well, the New York Times has never told that much truth in its entire existence. I don't know why I picked that paper. But we don't read that but it's the sort of thing that you would, in an honest analysis, read about what just happened to us. So it's not like we've never seen something like this before, but one ingredient that seems to be necessary to make it possible is indeed the role of credit creation, artificial money and credit creation by the Federal Reserve. And that brings me to probably the main point. And here I want to be as brief as I can. And that is also the contribution that the Fed makes to the business cycle. Now, this is a term that's used a lot, and which I think on the assumption that everybody just knows what the term business cycle is, what it means. But I mean, I think we can understand it fairly informally by just thinking about the fortunes of business and how they appear to move in a cyclical pattern, that everybody's doing well, and then everybody's doing badly, and then well, and then badly, and it seems to move in some kind of cyclical pattern. And the Austrian theory of the business cycle has enjoyed a kind of renaissance in recent years, because people who subscribe to it disproportionately are the ones who predicted the crisis that indeed unfolded. So people want to know, how did these people figure this out? What kind of inside information did they have? So they've gone and looked. And thanks to the internet, you can find some information on this easily. With one keystroke, you can find it. So I've talked about this at much greater length in other outlets, and I even put up a page because people would write to me and say, I want to know more about this stuff. So I put up a page on my site, it's a redirect to my site. It's learnaustrianeconomics.com. For people who feel like I don't even know where to start, and I look at Mises' Human Action and it seems too long, and I start to cry when I look at it. And I don't want to give up, though, so don't give up. LearnAustrianEconomics.com was made for you so that you can take baby steps into this thing. All right, basically the Austrian theory of the business cycle, first of all, comes out of the Austrian School of Economics, which is a school of thought. It's not a place. You can go to spend all the time you want in Vienna. You're not going to find the Austrian School of Economics. But I was in a debate once with the head of ING Insurance, America, the American branch. I mean, a big, big influential guy. And we were debating the financial crisis, what the policy response was. And I gave an overview of the Austrian school. And I repeat, I've made clear, this is a school of thought. It's not a building. You can't find it. You can't burn it down, whatever. It's a way of thinking. And I'm not kidding. This guy got up and said, you know, I don't mean any offense toward Tom. He seems like a bright guy. But, and I thought, oh my gosh, he found a hole in my reasoning. But okay, you know, I'm humble. I'll just take it in good humor and move on. But this is what he said. He said, do you know what the GDP of Austria is? It's like nothing. So he thought I was saying that we should do what Austria is doing. And then he was saying Austria is such an insignificant economy, why should we care? So I got up and said, well, that would be like saying, don't listen to Milton Friedman because the GDP of Chicago is pretty low. Like, it has nothing to do with... So I do have to explain that at the beginning. So the Austrian school starts in 1871 with Karl Menger, Principles of Economics, and the other key thinker is Eugen von Bombawerk, and then, of course, Ludwig von Mises, F.A. Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in 1974, back when they weren't just giving out Nobel Prizes like candy. And Israel Kirzner, Murray Rothbard, all these people work in that tradition. And we hear a lot about the Austrians saying that we believe in an economics that builds from the ground up, builds from the individual and his preferences, and we build a whole edifice of economic thought based on that. And a lot of times I think people think that's kind of a sweet, nice little throwaway line, that we build economics on the individual and individual choices. By the end of my remarks today, I want to explain to you why that's not just a throwaway line, why that's at the heart of Austrian economics, and it's the heart of the way we should think about the economy, and not thinking about the economy this way, thinking about the economy instead as like an organism unto itself, and we just need to manipulate aggregates relating to this organism is the source of our problems. So that's coming at the end. But the Austrian theory of the business cycle was first elaborated by Ludwig von Mises 100 years ago in 1912 in his book, The Theory of Money and Credit. He was 31 years old when he did this. And then he built on it, Hayek built on it. The one-sentence version basically is this. Now, I've done the one-sentence version, but I've even improved on that. There's a Facebook page called I Bet Ludwig von Mises Can Get More Fans Than John Maynard Keynes. And they had a challenge, can you explain the Austrian business cycle theory in haiku form? I did it. Yeah. No, wait till you hear my Japanese verse before you... Don't encourage me. All right, now what did I end up saying? It was... I don't want to use the word interest rates in a haiku. I think that ruins it, right? That's like, I don't want a haiku to be like reading a microwave oven instruction manual. So I want it to be a little bit more poetic. So mine was, build without savings, harmony into chaos, things go unfinished. Ooh, yeah. I don't really understand it, so it must be good. All right, the one-sentence version is that the free market sets interest rates, and by the way, it's going to be a long sentence with many conjunctions in it. When the free market sets interest rates, these interest rates mean something, and when you interfere with those interest rates, you create chaos where there was once coordination. Now, the longer version, again, this is just going to be just a brief overview, it basically would run like this. In the free market, entrepreneurs are not faced solely with the question, what products should I produce? What consumer goods should I produce? They're not faced just with that question. They're not just faced with what should I produce, in what quantities, using what factors of production, in what location. That's difficult enough. They also have to choose among an array of potential investment projects that differ in their duration and in their temporal remoteness from consumers. Now, that's a fancy way of saying that there are a lot of different investment projects I could choose to engage in that differ in terms of how long is it going to take before they produce some fruits that I can see. For example, research and development, that could go on for years before it ever produces any fruits that yield you a consumer good. It may never yield you a consumer good. You never know. There's no guarantee with research and development. So we would call that a very long-term project. Or expanding mining capacity. Well, mining, you know, when you're extracting raw materials, that is the very, very highest stage of production. Because nobody wants the raw materials coming out of a mine. It's got to go through a manufacturing process, be combined with other things, and labor, and yield you a consumer good. So that's very remote from consumers. A lot of levels of manufacturing, very remote from consumers. Whereas opening up a retail bakery is not remote from consumers, because I can instantly go there and right away there's a consumer good that's immediately serviceable to me. So that's a very short-term sort of project, because you're going to instantly turn out goods for the consumer. A coal mine is not instantly going to do that. When you expand mining capacity, it could take a very long time. Research and development could take a very long time before the consumer actually sees something come out of it. So the interest rates, the structure of interest rates that exist in the economy are an indispensable ingredient when the entrepreneur engages in monetary calculation, when he tries to appraise the situation and calculate which projects that I might embark on are likely to be profitable. He needs, just in the same way he needs the price system to make these calculations, he needs unhampered interest rates. Because he has to figure out not just what goods do the consumers want, but not everybody's involved in producing consumer goods. He may be involved, he may want to produce producers' goods, high-order goods that are far away and remote from consumers. He also needs to ask what we might call time structure of production do consumers demand. That is to say, how much are consumers willing to save, willing to defer consumption now so that they can have more consumer goods in the future? How much are they willing to defer their consumption so I can take some of these resources and apply them to research and development and apply them to longer-term projects? The interest rates help entrepreneurs answer these difficult questions. In other words, there needs to be a flow of savings to support long-term investment. If the public isn't willing to support these investments over the long term, they're not going to be profitable or sustainable. A simple example of this would be Robinson Crusoe. If ever possible, you go back to a one-person economy to illustrate things. Imagine Robinson Crusoe isolated on the island. And let's suppose he is, I think Peter Schiff uses this example, but it's an old Austrian example. Let's suppose Robinson Crusoe, of course, he needs to feed himself, and he has no capital goods. All he has is himself. So he's got to fish by just grabbing the fish with his bare hands. And this is a very time-consuming thing. I mean, he maybe gets one fish a day this way. And he decides it'd be much more efficient to fish if I had a net. The problem is the net is time-consuming to make. And all the time he takes making the net, he's not catching fish. So in order for him to... Now, once he gets the net, he's going to have a lot of fish. He'll have a lot of consumer goods coming in once he builds that capital good. But that's going to take time. And so how's he going to make that net if he doesn't first save? He's got to save up some fish to sustain himself while he makes the net. Otherwise, that project is not sustainable. Well, the same thing goes, you just aggregate that now to the economy, the same thing goes for the economy. If the public is not willing to save the way Crusoe saved fish so he could sustain the net project, it will not be possible to sustain all the high-order projects. Now, when we save, what we are implicitly doing, we don't realize we're doing it, we are implicitly handing over resources to entrepreneurs to engage in long-term production. If we save, we're not buying as many consumer goods. That's sort of the definition. If we're not buying as many toothbrushes and hats and magazine subscriptions, then those industries will shrink a bit, and they won't need as many trucks, and they won't need as many laborers, and they won't need as much lumber. Where do those released resources go? Well, this is where the high-order stages, the mining, the manufacturing, the building new physical plant, this is where they get their resources, the releasing from lower-order stages closer to the consumer. So this all works out. How do entrepreneurs know that suddenly now more resources are available? The answer? Low interest rates. The public saves, that lowers the interest rate. The entrepreneur says, okay, now's the time to engage in long-term production because it's much less painful to borrow money long-term when it's cheap. So you notice the harmony that takes place. Consumers defer consumption, and businessmen now take this opportunity to engage in producing for the future, when people will be interested in consuming in the future. They're deferring consumption for now, they'll consume in the future. They're releasing resources right now that can be used to produce the goods in the long term. And that's how it works, that's how the market works. But what happens if you get the central bank, you get the Federal Reserve, and it artificially lowers interest rates through its various means? Let's say it just pushes them down. Well, in that case, entrepreneurs again see low interest rates, but the problem here is now there's a mismatch, because now the necessary resources to make all these projects work have not been made available. And they will find that the costs of engaging in their projects are much higher than they thought. The factors of production they need, labor, land, capital goods, man-made factors of production, are much more expensive than they anticipated they would be, because they're not in as great of abundance as was anticipated. They are still very much in demand in the consumer goods industries, and they just do not have the wherewithal to bid these resources away in the long term. And so in other words, what happens in the short run, just in a short summary, is that basically the economy is put into a configuration that just doesn't work. Things are put in places where the whole picture is just not going to work together. It's not going to work harmoniously. The recession period is the period of cleansing, is the period when the economy realizes, this can't work. Things have been deployed in the wrong way. We have too much long-term production. We've got the wrong kinds of production going on, really is what's going on. We have the wrong kinds of things being produced. They don't match up with consumer preferences. And so the wrong things are being done. People are working in the wrong lines. Resources have been deployed in the wrong way. The allocations are all wrong. So the recession is the beginning of the process by which all these resources get shuffled around the economy. And this can be time-consuming, and a lot of wealth can be destroyed because some projects just can't be finished. And so it would have been better if they hadn't been started at all. And a lot of the things that have been sort of half-finished are not convertible into usable things. So it's a deadweight loss. So this is what's going on. When all these entrepreneurial errors caused by the interference with interest rates, the interference in the free market come to light, and then the resources get shuffled around to where they belong, that's the return to health. Now, when we get recessions, immediately people want to make it easier on us, right? They want to ease the pain. We want to get through this recession pain-free. How do we do that? By lowering interest rates even further, even though the low interest rates caused the problem initially. Now we make them lower, and that supposedly will solve the problem. But if you're trying to avoid the recession by saying, there's nothing wrong with the economy as it is that a little extra money pumped in won't fix. There are no allocation problems, just that the organism isn't growing fast enough. We got to just pump it up with dough. If that's your approach, what you're doing is you're just freezing all these errors into place, and you're going to add new errors. You're just making the situation worse. That's exactly what Alan Greenspan did in 2001. 2001, there's a recession. It's after the collapse of the dot-com bubble. And what does Greenspan want to do? Well, what does any Fed chairman want to do? He wants to lower interest rates. That's the only solution he's got, right? When all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So we're going to lower interest rates. He does this 11 times in 2001. And so sure enough, he gets a boom going. But exactly what is he doing? He's perpetuating the errors. Instead of allowing the economy to cleanse itself, the errors continue. So this is the first and only recession on record in which housing starts jumped during a recession. Normally housing goes down with everything else. And that would have been nice if it had, because it would have gotten people out of this. It would have removed this temptation to speculation in real estate, that I'm going to have 5 investment houses even though I have no job and there won't be any down payment, and this seems like a way to get rich. Like that should have alerted people something's wrong here. Like that can't possibly work. But instead of getting red lights, which the economy was trying to give people, all the lights were green. Carry on as before, citizens. Nothing to see here. And so when the bust inevitably came, if a configuration of the economy can't work in the long run, it can't work in the long run. When the bust inevitably came, it was all the worse because in the intervening years, thanks to Greenspan, more and more people than ever are jumping into the housing game. So now the misallocations of resources are all the worse. Now, there are 2 main ways in which the interference of the Fed falsifies people's calculations, economic calculations. We've already seen how it falsifies the calculations of entrepreneurs trying to choose, should I engage in this sort of project or this sort of project? This one's longer term, this one's shorter term. It's going to depend on what the interest rate is. Can I afford to borrow the money for so long? That's going to be, there's a lot of white noise thrown into that decision making by the Fed. So we've already seen that. But also on the consumer side, consumers are going to see that their incomes are going to go up because people who work on these brand new projects, they're going to get new wages, new jobs created. It's going to look like things are great. Their house prices are going way up. And so they're going to have a false appraisal of their own income and net worth situation. And this is going to stimulate consumption on the part of consumers, and it's going to depress savings, which is exactly what happened in the crisis. Mises himself, in a beautiful passage, sums up exactly how the interference with interest rates screws up the calculations both of entrepreneurs and of ordinary consumers simultaneously. Mises says, "It would be a serious blunder to neglect the fact that inflation also generates forces which tend toward capital consumption. One of its consequences is that it falsifies economic calculation and accounting. It produces the phenomenon of imaginary or apparent profits. If the rise in the prices of stocks and real estate is considered as a gain, the illusion is no less manifest. What makes people believe that inflation results in general prosperity is precisely such illusory gains. They feel lucky and become open-handed in spending and enjoying life. They embellish their homes, they build new mansions, and patronize the entertainment business. In spending apparent gains, the fanciful result of false reckoning, they are consuming capital. It does not matter who these spenders are. They may be businessmen or stock jobbers. They may be wage earners. Everyone is subject to these calculation problems." Now, in the recent case, the phenomenon Mises was describing was, of course, reflected in the purchase of more and larger homes. And this was, of course, made possible by the very low interest rates, that policy that was pursued by the Federal Reserve, particularly if you look at between 2000 and 2004. Now, there have been attempts made to exonerate the Fed of blame for the housing bubble. And there are 2 main claims that are made, and I'd like to address them both briefly. The first one is that Greenspan's policies were, in fact, moderate and not extreme in any way. And secondly, low interest rates and the housing boom were caused not by Greenspan and the Federal Reserve, but by people saving in Asia. All right, let's take first things first. A moderate policy. Well, between 2000 and 2004, the monetary base and the M1 measure of the money supply grew at rates comparable to what we saw in the 1970s. 1970s were not known as a hard money decade. Mortgage rates during the housing bubble's peak were the lowest they have been in the entire 4 decades for which the St. Louis Fed keeps records. Now, in case you're thinking I picked out the St. Louis Fed just to pick some arbitrary regional Fed bank that seems to conform to my explanation of things, the St. Louis Fed is a website that basically everybody goes to generate graphs and stuff. It's a treasure trove of statistics. So I don't buy the first claim. Second claim boils down to it wasn't Greenspan's fault, it was the Asian savers. Well, for a guy who's going to claim that this was not his fault and it was Asian savers, at the time it was going on, he sure seemed to want to take the credit for the upturn. He seemed perfectly happy to make at least apparent to or it seemed apparent to him, that he had influence over interest rates and that the resulting prosperity was something for which he and the Fed ought to take credit. But when things turned sour, suddenly I had nothing to do with this, people. I don't know what you're talking about. Interest rates? Well, we have no influence over that. Now, the statistic that is pointed to justify this Asian saver explanation is that savings as a percentage of GDP among emerging and developing countries grew very dramatically right around the time the housing boom was getting going. But the problem with this explanation is that when the housing bust came, Asian saving continued to increase. So the argument is the Asian saving lowered the interest rates. But look at when you think about the graphs here, interest rates in the U.S., I'm talking about mortgages and just American interest rates came way down thanks to the Fed, then they started to climb back up, and then we got the bust. So that's the graph of interest rates in the U.S. Here's the graph of Asian saving. How does that explain this? I don't know. I don't think it does. I don't think these explanations persuade. Now, in light of this, in light of a crisis like this, the Fed and supporters of the Fed oftentimes will urge us to support various forms of stimulus, whether fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus. Now, I think you can glean, perhaps from what I've said so far, what the Austrian response to stimulus programs would be. The stimulus programs are at best beside the point. Like a fiscal stimulus program is at best beside the point. Because what it's going to do is it's going to take resources and just shuffle them to economically arbitrary projects, to projects that conform to what politicians want. And that's going to make things better. But that's not the problem in the economy. The problem is all the discoordination caused by years of malinvestments. Malinvestments encouraged by misleading interest rates. That's the problem. Just blowing a lot of dough on some bridge projects doesn't fix the underlying issue. And of course, monetary stimulus is just going to make it worse by encouraging the very malinvestments that were encouraged by the initial low interest rates. That's what Hayek meant in the 70s when he said that the apparent prosperity that monetary inflation brings about is a result of the errors that it causes. So yeah, it creates a lot of activity. Yes, okay, I suppose we could create a lot of activity. Stalin, at gunpoint, created a lot of activity. It's not activity per se. It's the consumer and his wants that need to be catered to, and they're not being catered to when money is coming in streams to projects that it wouldn't have been directed to under a free market. And here's where I get back to the point I made at the very beginning about Austrians as methodological individualists and viewing the economy not as some independent organism that we need to tame and we need to apply certain technical analysis to, and there are certain large aggregates by which we can measure its performance, and we need to manipulate those aggregates. And once we've manipulated those aggregates, we have solved the underlying problem. Economists like this don't even comprehend the problem. It's not a matter of this thing needs to be made bigger. Like what happens is they see GDP growth slowing or coming down. And they think that's the problem. We can just get that number, one big number. We can just get that number up there. We've solved the problem. But the Austrian would say that's just a symptom of the problem. The fact that GDP growth slows or goes into decline is not itself the problem. It's a symptom of the lack of plan coordination that has been taking place in the economy. It's a symptom of the misallocated resources. It's a symptom of all these micro-level mistakes that have been made. It's not one big macro blob. That obscures everything interesting that's going on in the economy. That obscures all the micro mistakes that entrepreneurs have been misled into making. And I don't mean to say that entrepreneurs would be infallible otherwise. Of course people are going to go out of business once in a while, but in a business cycle, at the trough, we see an abnormal number of them having these same sorts of problems in the same direction at the same time. And this cluster of error, as Lionel Robbins said, and Rothbard and Mises said, and Hayek, is caused by the interference with interest rates. This is where Austrians and the mainstream are just talking past each other. And that's why it's not just some kind of throwaway platitude to say we think of the economy, we think first about the individual and his preferences and the individual as an actor. That's where we look. We look at the errors made at the individual level, not thinking in terms of some macro aggregate as telling the story. When you tell a story at that level of aggregation, you miss every interesting thing. I mean, it's missing the trees for the forest, actually, I think would be the way of putting it. The exact opposite of that saying. Now, some economists, continuing this highly aggregative, highly anti-individualistic approach, will argue that stimulus is just self-evidently desirable. Now, I've already sort of hinted at what the problems with stimulus are, but even from a political point of view, they'll say no one can object if we stimulate the housing market back to where it used to be. But indeed, if we again look at society as being composed of individuals and not just as one big blob, we'll see that individuals have vastly differing interests. And yes, it's true that it must have been very hard on a lot of people who were heavily into real estate or who had investments related to real estate to see this market correction, a severe market correction. And it's tempting to say, therefore, we should bail that whole thing out. And that would be great for everybody. But the point is, what is a market correction if not the rest of society saying this previous array of prices was wrong? And yes, it's terrible for you guys heavily invested in real estate to see your expectations and plans just fall out beneath you. But that's only because your expectations and plans were at odds with everybody else's expectations and plans. And why should those other people have to suffer or pay for the stimulus to make these people whole? When in fact, what a market correction is a bunch of individuals basically saying through buying and abstention from buying that these prices were too high. And we want to see them lower. Who is the government or the Federal Reserve to say otherwise, to second guess that? Well, of course, the people who lost in the bust, of course, are going to be at the forefront calling for, demanding that there be some stimulus to reinflate a tire with a giant hole in it. But the rest of society has interests too, and they don't necessarily lie in making sure that some arbitrary asset reaches some arbitrary price level. So in short, what do we need? We need Austrian economics, the Austrian school of economics, which views the economy in a way that illuminates rather than obscures. And as I've said, you can head over to learnaustrianeconomics.com, and that's all free resources. Okay, this is not some secret way for me to make money off you guys. That's why I'm promoting. You go there, it's videos and audio, so you can listen in your car. It's articles, some books, but most of them are available online too. So I recommend doing that. But I want to remind you guys of who you guys are. I mean, the fact that you're here. There are a lot of crazy things going on at Purdue today, right? I mean, you could be involved in that. But instead, you're here, okay? For some reason, you are dorky enough that you said, nope, I don't want to have fun. This is my idea of fun, baby. That's wonderful. That means you belong to the remnant. The remnant is how Albert J. Nock referred to people like us. Ron Paul uses that term a lot, the remnant. Albert J. Nock had this essay about the remnant years ago, Isaiah's Job. And he said that, you know, we're a small minority out there, and it's our job to find each other. And we can make things happen. I'm a little more optimistic than Nock was. Okay, if you're feeling depressed, don't read him. I'm a little more optimistic. We can find each other now thanks to the internet. I mean, it must have been like looking for a needle in a haystack in Albert J. Nock's day to find somebody who agreed with him. Whereas you put up a video on YouTube, people come and view it, and you get to know people, and you have conferences like this which get a lot of people showing up at them. You belong to that remnant that believes in liberty, that hasn't been brainwashed by the propaganda. You guys are actually, this is the hope for the future. Because it's true, we are a minority, but the vast bulk of other people are not really engaged one way or the other in issues like this. And if this became the chic way to think, well, you know what? A lot of those people who are not committed one way or the other would come along. So what we need to do is cultivate that remnant. And what's the best thing you can do as an individual? The only person on this earth you know you can improve for a fact is yourself. Yeah, you could change other people's minds maybe. The only person you can improve for sure is yourself. There are a lot of things you need to read and study and learn. We can't afford to be second best or to be hacks who can give a good speech but don't actually know the stuff. We got to know our stuff because we're a minority. Each one of us has to be like 2 or 3 people to make up for our lack of numbers. We have to be people who impress the uncommitted, who will say, now that guy knows what he's talking about. That's how we cultivate the remnant, we build it up, and we transform it from a group of people grumbling about the state of things to the group of people that men of goodwill look to transform society and to bring, indeed, that pearl of great price for us, politically anyway, is the free society we once had and can indeed have again. Thank you very much.